You will own nothing and be happy, especially now that the Trudeau government has eliminated the GST on new rental buildings, essentially incentivizing builders to no longer build homes that are intended to be owned by you, but instead to be owned by developers and investors, and also keeping intact, at least in part, the burden for somebody who is purchasing a brand new property to pay at least in part the GST, while developers, speculators, and investors who are building with the intention of renting no longer have to have that same burden. And while this move may seem popular, as it is perceived not to impact home values because it affects the rental industry and not residentially owned properties, the truth is it is going to have an effect on the value of the property that you own. And I'll explain how in a minute. But before we get into it, my name is Nolan Matthias, and if you want to thrive financially, this is the place for you. So do me a favor, hit the subscribe button and hit the like button so more people like you can see this video. And if you're watching it and you look down and you see that you're not subscribed, but you thought you already subscribed to my channel, well, keep in mind this one is brand new and it is completely focused on Canadian real estate. So you may be subscribed to my other channel that is now focused more on wealth building and personal finance, but may not have already subscribed to this one, so make sure you click that button. And also don't forget, you can still go to mortgagesecrets.ca to get my Mortgage Secrets book for free. All you have to do is pay the shipping and handling. Okay, so let's get into it because this is big news. The federal government announced today that they are going to remove the GST on new purpose-built rental buildings. Now, this is kind of insane because part of the press release was them talking about the fact that housing, at least housing supply, is something that takes decades to affect. So in other words, what they're saying is that this is going to be a slow process and that the outcome of this is probably not going to be felt for a very, very long time. But ironically, this is something that the federal government promised in 2015, obviously recognizing back then that we had a housing issue, but they did little to address it until it was too late. So I'm not politically motivated here, but keep that in mind as you're paying attention to the stories around this in the next couple of weeks and leading up to what is probably a 2025 election. This was a promise made long ago that they're finally delivering on, kind of. But this has pretty significant repercussions because what this is going to do is it's going to incentivize builders, developers, real estate investors who may have previously only bought one unit at a time to actually build properties that are no longer designed to be owned by you. And by the way, if you want to buy a brand new property, you're going to continue, at least in part, to have to pay the GST. So all of the advantages are now being tipped in the favor of people who are going to rent out properties. Now, why is this so important to understand? Well, first, it's because it's not fair, but second is because there's a significant wealth gap between those who own properties and those who don't. And yes, you might suggest that this is the product of housing prices that have run up over the last couple of years, but the fact is that this discrepancy has been present for a very long time. And the reality is people who own property, who own real estate, have significantly higher net worths than those who don't. So any sort of incentive like what was done today that encourages people to rent or encourages rental properties to be built, even though those are largely needed in our country right now, actually creates a scenario where people could find themselves 20, 30 years down the road where they have significantly less money and significantly less net worth. And this is data from Stats Canada that shows clearly the purple lines being people who own houses having significantly higher net worths than people who don't. In fact, on average in Canada, those who own properties at the age of, I believe it's 65, have about a $900,000 net worth versus those who have never owned who only have a net worth of about $40,000. And that's because no matter what you say about where your money is best used and best invested, the reality is that home ownership causes people to pay down debt and eventually get to the point where they have equity in a property that's gone up in value and a mortgage that's been reduced and therefore a significantly higher net worth versus those who rent don't get that same debt pay down benefit or the appreciation benefit, and they also tend not to put a lot of money into savings. Most people who are oriented towards renting are people that aren't necessarily oriented towards savings either. And I'm not trying to categorize them as worse or better, but what I am saying is that people have tendencies, and that seems to be the trend, at least what the data shows when it comes to renting versus owning a home. Now, obviously, there was a little bit of coordination here because at the same time as this was being contemplated by the Liberal caucus, it was also being announced yesterday that Trudeau is funding the first ever deal in London, Ontario, for a portion of the $4 billion housing fund that is designed to create more properties. And guess what? A lot of them are going to be rentals because builders are now incentivized to build rentals rather than not. In fact, their margins have gone up about 5%, which is a substantial increase in margins for organizations that are in the construction industry. Now, in order to get a portion of this $4 billion funding, cities have to agree to basically increase density. So what that means is build properties that are, instead of single-family homes, duplexes, fourplexes, or even small condos, townhouses, or apartment buildings. And simultaneously, as the elimination of the GST was being announced, Calgary Mayor Jyoti Gondek posted this on Twitter. It's a letter from the Minister of Housing suggesting that if they want a piece of that $4 billion pie, they better get their act together and start promoting more density around, why can't I remember what a train or bus is called? Oh, more density around transit areas. Now, this is around the same time the city of Calgary is addressing their affordability crisis. Now, that being said, it's significantly more affordable to live in Calgary than it is in Toronto or Vancouver, but at least Calgary is a little bit ahead of the game here as they're discussing it before prices get to $1 million plus, like those other two cities. But here's the question that you're probably asking is, what does this mean for you? Does it mean that rental properties are going to be cheaper? Well, maybe. If there's significantly increased supply, maybe rents will come down a little bit. Or maybe developers will continue to build at the same rate because of other factors associated with building, and they're just going to pocket that extra 5%. And then the question is, well, what if they do build enough supply so that rents come down? What does that mean for everybody else? Well, what that means is that people are going to gravitate towards renting instead of buying. And what that means is less demand for buying, which means property values might go down. And I think that's largely why the federal government made the announcement today around rentals and not housing in general. Because if they make it about rentals, it's perceived that that's not going to affect the value of my home, and therefore I'm going to continue to vote for you because you're not going to depreciate the value of my assets. But the reality here is that that is not the case. This is just moving pieces of the puzzle, and ultimately, if this is successful, and there's reasons that I hope it should be, and there's reasons that I hope it won't be. But if this is successful, it will absolutely impact property values as people gravitate towards the lower cost of living options. So don't think that just because you own a home and this applies to renters that you're out of the woods. It won't. Oh, and by the way, if you live in an area that's close to transit or close to a downtown main street, you're probably going to find yourself in a situation where maybe you own a single family home and you're going to be notified about things like fourplexes or eightplexes or 42 plexes being built just down the block. And in all likelihood, there's nothing you're going to be able to do to stop the higher density housing, even if you've lived in those areas for 30, 40, 50 years. There's no question that the trend for housing in Canada, at least for right now, is going to shift towards more rental housing, more purpose-built rentals, and significantly higher density. I don't think we'll ever get to the stage where we are similar to Europe, at least not in my lifetime, but that's definitely the direction that we're heading. So let me know what you think of this. 2015 election promise, what do you think about the Liberals putting it into place now rather than back then? And how do you feel about whether or not this is the right thing for the Canadian economy? Oh, and if you want to check out more about what's going on with the mortgage industry and certain lenders maybe not renewing mortgages, make sure you check out this video right here.